Well, good morning. It's good to see everybody today and glad to have you with us, especially if you're visiting. Look around and see some faces I haven't seen before. So if you're visiting with us, please take a minute, fill out a visitor's card. It should be right in the pew in front of you, either a green card or a yellow card or whatever assortment of colors you might have today. And please fill that out and let us have that to be able to get in contact with you as we move forward. But please come back anytime you have a chance. We're glad that you're here, and we hope that you'll feel like an honored guest today here at the LJ Church. I want to take just a minute as we get into the lesson to thank everybody for your concerns and calls and prayers for me this week. I posted this picture on Tuesday morning on Facebook, and I do want to explain what happened and how I ended up in such a condition. I started to feel bad towards the end of last week, and on Sunday was really not feeling well. I got up here and preached, and I had a pretty high fever. I was kind of delirious, and several of you told me that was the best lesson that you'd heard since I got here. So I don't know how to take that, but I went home and Sunday afternoon and tried to come back Sunday evening, but couldn't. And Chase did a great job filling in. And so we were supposed to leave to go to polishing the pulpit on Sunday night, and I was just in no condition to go. So Monday morning, fever broke a little bit. I called Chase. I said, Chase, let's get in the car. Let's go to Sevierville, go to polishing the pulpit. One of the worst decisions that I've ever made in my whole life. So we got there on Monday after some pit stops along the way, and Chase was able to go to some of the lectures, and I just continued to feel worse and was having lots of problems, and fever wouldn't break again. And so on Tuesday morning, I went to urgent care, was extremely dehydrated, so they gave me 2 bags of IV fluid. They gave me 2 shots. The first was a steroid shot, and they brought in what looked like a normal-sized human being needle. And then they said, all right, this is the second shot. This is going to be an antibiotic shot. And they brought in a needle that looked like what you would use on a large animal. Brandon, maybe something you would have used on one of those bulls that you give a shot to. And this was what my face looked like after that second shot. So anyhow, after all that, was able to go home or go back to the place that we were staying on Tuesday and felt a little better Tuesday evening, was able to go to a lecture or two, and then Wednesday started feeling more back to normal, and then on Thursday we were able to come home. So rough week. I'm still battling the cough and things that go along with it, with the sinus infection and stomach bug and whatever was going on, but I am feeling better. I do appreciate all your calls and cares and concerns, and I know Carla is thankful for an opportunity to look at me and say, I told you so again. So this morning we're going to continue our discussion, growing into godliness. This is now our 4th part of this, and we're going to have a couple more that go along with it. But the idea of this is, how can we, in a real way, be more godly people, growing into godliness? And last week we spent a great deal of time defining what that word godly means. Excuse me. And we left off with a working definition. And I want us to remember this. This is something, when we look at what the word means in the Greek and the Hebrew, something we kind of came up with together. That godliness, for the purposes of our study, is going to mean a fear, reverence, or respect for what God has done for us that leads to holiness or godliness within. So fear, reverence, or respect for what God has done for us that leads to holiness or godliness within. That holiness then manifests itself into the way that we live every day. So that God within us has caused a change, and that change within us is going to manifest itself in the way that we live. And of course, we've used as sort of a slogan Romans chapter 12 and verse 2, and do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So as we move into the practical part of this discussion, as we move away from the heart and from the mind and from the soul and into the outward manifestations of the body, it's important that we remember that pure heart, that thing within us, will make us sound and look and act. And I hope you'll hear what I'm saying here. Make us look, make us sound, make us act more like Jesus. That's our ultimate goal. Because here's the thing. People are looking for authenticity. People are looking for the real thing. People are looking, as we talked about last week, for a genuine representation of something they can get behind and follow. That people are looking for something that they can be attracted to. So when people look for somebody to follow, they're not looking for somebody that just acts like everybody else. They're looking for somebody unique that stands out. I think the best example of that comes from Jesus himself. You want to look at Matthew chapter 4. Matthew chapter 4, beginning of verse 18. I'll give you a minute to get there. Matthew 4:18, it says, "And Jesus, walking by the Sea of Galilee, saw two brothers, Simon called Peter and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, 'Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men.' They immediately left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, in the boat with Zebedee, their father, mending their nets. And he called them, and immediately they left their boat and their father and followed him." I mean, isn't that amazing? I think for some reason we've always taught that, well, this is the first time they ever saw Jesus. I don't think that's the case. I'm sure they had seen Jesus and the things that he'd been doing, and they were aware of his reputation. But can you imagine somebody with the charisma to come to your job site and say, "Hey, I know this is the way that you bring in money. I know this is how you provide for your family. I know this is how you put food on your table, but leave it behind and come with me"? Can you imagine that at your work site? Can you imagine somebody showing up at your job and say, "Hey, put your stuff down and come on, we got work to do"? I mean, can you imagine what you'd say? Well, wait now, Jesus, how are we going to make money? Where are we going to stay? How are we going to eat? How are we going to be taken care of? Who's going to help my father out in the boat, Jesus? What's the plan? What are we going to do? They don't do any of that. They put down their nets. They get out of the boat and they go and they follow him. Let me tell you this. If we want people to be attracted to us, we have to have the same character, the same seriousness, and we have to be unique and stand out in the same way that Jesus did. If not, people will never follow us and we'll never get them to the goal that we're trying to get them to, which is salvation through Jesus Christ. The reason that we're different, the reason that we're calling each of us to godliness in this series of lessons is not so that people will look and say, "Oh, the Church of Christ over there at LJ, those are the most righteous, most serious, most authentic group of Christians we've ever met." That's all good. That's all well and good, but that doesn't really matter. Our righteousness is not judged by other people. Our righteousness is judged by the righteous judge himself. We're doing it so that people will see Jesus living in us and want to know who he is. That's why we're trying to develop this godliness and this righteousness. And that's so important that we develop that. So this morning, we're going to talk about godly speech. Godly speech. It's important that people understand what we're trying to communicate. It's important that people hear the words that we're trying to say, that they understand the message. And I think sometimes we are bad communicators in that the words that we use don't get across the intended message. Heard a story last week about a little boy who was digging a hole in his backyard. Had a shovel and he was just digging a hole. And the neighbor next door came and said, "Well, son, why are you digging this hole?" He said, "Well, my goldfish died and I'm digging this hole to bury my goldfish." So he went back to digging, continued to dig the hole. Finally, the man, he couldn't help it. He couldn't stop being so curious. He said, "Well, son, that seems like a mighty big hole for a little bitty goldfish." And he said, "Well, I guess I should include that the goldfish is inside your stupid cat." He was not articulating and communicating the whole message, that it wasn't just the goldfish that was being buried, the cat was going with him. It's important that we communicate clearly, but it's also important that we communicate in a way where people don't miss what we're saying because of our poor lack of word, or our poor choice of words, our lack of tact in choosing the way that we communicate. We say all the time that, well, as long as people understand what I'm saying, the way I say it doesn't matter. Well, that's not true. Communication is so important. Can't deal with that cough drop anymore. I want to suggest to you this morning that we use our 4G communication. Now, that sounds familiar to you because on your cell phone, if you watch your cell phone, in the top right corner, you'll have a little thing that says 4G. It's the way that we communicate now through cell phone service, 4G LTE service. That's how we make our phone calls and communications. Well, I'm going to give you 4Gs this morning that I think will help us better communicate with each other and with those people around us and help us to have a godly choice of words in the way that we speak. 4 characteristics that will help us have speech. So if I come up to you in the next couple of weeks and I say, are you using your 4G? This is what I mean. And I hope that we're able to use these. 4G communication, 4G speech. Number 1, our speech should be gracious. Our speech should be gracious. Colossians chapter 4 and verse 6 says, let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. Our speech should be gracious. So important that the way that we say things not affect the things that we say. For instance, if I were to come up to you and I was going to criticize something that you said or what it might be, if I went up to you and I said, look, I just want to pull you aside and talk to you a minute about what you said. You know, it was great and I understood what you meant, but next time you might want to phrase it this way. It's a lot different than me walking up to you and said, do you realize what you said? Do you realize how silly that thing sounded? Do you realize that you ruined what you were trying to say by the way that you communicated it? Well, those are 2 different ways of expressing the same thought. Our words need to be gracious. Our words need to appeal to people in a way that will make them more attractive. So the first thing in our 4G speaking there is our words should be gracious. Second, our words should be gentle. Proverbs chapter 15 verses 1 and 2. A gentle answer deflects anger, but harsh words make tempers flare. The tongue of the wise makes knowledge appealing, but the mouth of a fool belches out foolishness. That's from the New Living Translation. The New King James says, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. So not only should our words be gracious in the way that they come across, they should be gentle. Meaning I should always look for the softest way to communicate something to somebody. That's a hard thing to do sometimes because sometimes we say, you know what, I'm just blunt. I'm just going to say what I mean. As Christians, we're not afforded that luxury. The Bible tells us that we need to be gentle in the way that we approach each other. So gracious and gentle. How about this one? Genuine. Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 22. Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who deal truthfully are his delight. Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord. Our words need to be truthful and honest. Spencer read that passage. If anyone speaks, let him speak as the oracles of God. So many times we're going to talk about lying and dishonesty in a minute, but so many times the words that come out of our mouth are not really what we mean. So many times when we say things, it's not saying them in the most appropriate way, and it's not saying them in the most truthful way. Thank you. We have to be honest. That means telling the truth. That means not gossiping. That means not making things come across in a way that doesn't seem genuine. So, gracious, gentle, genuine. The fourth one, our words, our speech should be guarded. Psalm 141 and verse 3, David says, set a guard, O Lord, over my mouth. Keep watch over the door of my lips. You ever just said something and as the words went out, you wish you could trap them and swallow them back down. Unfortunately, that's not how words work. Once we say them, they're out there. We need to be guarded in the way that we say things and in the things that we say. We need to choose our words carefully. So 4G speech: gracious, gentle, genuine, and guarded. If we could apply those things to everything that we say, I think it'll make a big difference. So when I come and ask you, are you using your 4G when you talk? This is what we mean. Some things to avoid. We're trying to develop godly speech. We want to have language. We want to use words that appeal to people. What are some things to avoid? One preacher said this about our choice of speech. I thought this was pretty good. It says, we're quick to avoid murder and stealing and drunkenness, but we often assassinate fellow believers and leave destruction in our wake by the way that we use our tongues. Husbands have stabbed their wives with words that are as sharp as daggers, and wives have lashed out with tongues that cut and pierce. Parents have devastated their children by repeated blasts of venom. Kids have exploded at their parents with volleys that have leveled the family like a bomb. And churches themselves have been wiped out by wagging tongues that have sliced, diced, and chopped people to shreds. You know, we're really good at avoiding the big sins, right? I mean, none of us would go out and commit adultery. None of us are going to go out and kill anybody. None of us are going to go out and break the law in a very public way. We're upstanding citizens. But let me make this very clear. If we sin with our words, that is equal to any other of the big major sins that we could commit. And here's what we fail to realize sometimes. The sins that we commit with our words can be just as wholly devastating as those other sins that we commit that might be bigger or grander in magnitude or in scale. The effect of a word spoken out of place or out of turn can have long-lasting eternal consequences. And we have to start applying that and understanding how serious it is. So, some things to avoid. Number one, foul language. Turn over to Ephesians 5 with me. Ephesians chapter 5. Turn your Bibles there. First in chapter 4, verse 29, which is leading into this, Ephesians 4:29 says, let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers. It's important elaborating on that concept of gracious speech. But notice chapter 5, verse 4. My paper flies away there. Chapter 5, verse 4. Neither filthiness nor foolish talking, nor coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving of thanks. He's picking up in the middle of the thought there about how to walk in love. He says to not use filthy language, nor, I like that, foolish talking. So the first thing we have to avoid is using foul or filthy language. And this just should be self-explanatory. And I know every one of us have been in that situation where you're hammering a nail on the wall and you hit your fingernail with that hammer, and at that moment, words that you didn't even know that you knew come into your mind and out of your mouth. Look, we need to do better on that. We know that we shouldn't be using those words even in that situation. But what I'm talking about is everyday use of inappropriate language. And you might be sitting there and you might say, well, I don't use foul language. I don't cuss, so that's not talking about me. Well, using foul language can be things other than cussing. One thing that we're really comfortable with is using euphemisms. Things that might not be the actual word but mean the same thing as the word. And we're not going to post a list up here, but you know what I'm talking about. What's the difference in those? If we use a word that means the same as the word that we don't want to say, why not just say the word to begin with? So we need to avoid using foul language. We also need to avoid using euphemisms that just mean the same thing. We also need to stay away from vulgar language. sexual innuendo, things that give us a good snicker, but we know what they actually mean. Because here's the thing, if we use foul language and we use euphemisms and we use innuendo and we use these things that, yeah, they're not actually the ugly words, but people know that we're doing the same thing. Our speech is supposed to be with grace, seasoned with salt. It's supposed to be different. It's supposed to be wholesome. It's supposed to build people up. Well, using euphemisms and innuendo don't make us any different than everybody else, and except for the fact that we don't use the actual big words. So we need to avoid the use of foul language. We need to avoid gossip. So we need to avoid foul language. We need to avoid gossip. Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 28 says, a perverse man sows strife and a whisperer separates the best of friends. Unfortunately, gossip is one of the biggest problems in churches all over the world. You have a group of people that come together and they share so much time, they invest so much in each other, and we learn so much about each other that from time to time we have a lapse in judgment and we begin to gossip. And a lot of times, for some reason, we associate gossip and stereotype it as something that only women do. And that's just not true. Now, women may have perfected the art, but men engage in it as well. Gossip is something that affects everybody. And gossip is different from lying in that a lot of times gossip is true. But when we repeat gossip, we're repeating things that ought not to be repeated. And we're real good at justifying gossip too. It kind of tickles me. It says, I want to tell you this thing, but I'm not really gossiping because, I'm just repeating a prayer request that somebody gave me. Or I'm just repeating something that you ought to know. When something is told to us in confidence, we don't repeat it. We have to treasure that confidentiality that comes through being brothers and sisters in Christ. We got to stop gossiping. We've got to stop talking about other people behind their backs. Here's a good rule of thumb. Don't say anything when somebody's not around that you wouldn't say when they were around. Meaning, don't say anything behind anybody's back that you wouldn't say to their face. And if you're really good at saying ugly things to people's face, then don't say it that way either. Stop gossiping. It's pretty simple. The Bible has passage after passage that talks about it, but we need to stop saying things that are hurtful and things that don't have any benefit. So we should avoid gossip. So we're avoiding foul language. We're avoiding gossip. This shouldn't have to be said, but we'll repeat it. We need to avoid lying. We need to avoid not telling the truth in whatever shape, form, or fashion that may present itself. Whether it's cheating on a test or lying to somebody that we come into contact with, whether it's lying to our spouse or our parents or whatever it might be, we need to avoid lying. That's pretty self-explanatory. Fourthly, we need to avoid talking too much. And not just because you'll lose your voice like me, but we need to avoid talking too much. Ecclesiastes, the 5th chapter, verses 2 and 3, says, do not be rash with your mouth, and let not your heart utter anything hastily before God. For God is in heaven and you on earth, therefore let your words be few. For a dream comes through much activity, and a fool's voice is known by his many words. We need to avoid talking too much. And lastly, things to avoid, we need to avoid speaking while we're angry. James chapter 1, verse 19, we know that passage very well, but it's one we always need to have in the forefront of our minds. James chapter 1, verse 19. So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. For the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. We need to stop speaking while we're angry. So, we've given some descriptions of wholesome, godly speech. We've talked about some things that we need to avoid. We've given the list of bad kinds of speech. So, Here we are once again at the point of a lesson where we've been told all the negative, we've been told all the bad things that we do and all the mistakes that we make. So, what are some things we can do to fix it? We've given you 4 G's of speech. We've given you 5 things to avoid, so it only follows that we give you 6 practical suggestions as we end the lesson this morning that'll help us all be more godly in the way that we speak to each other. 6 suggestions to make us more godly in the way that we speak. Number 1, practice brevity. Number 1, practice brevity. And that goes hand in hand with what we just said a minute ago. We need to talk less. Proverbs, the 17th chapter. Proverbs 17 and verse 28 says this: even a fool is counted wise when he holds his peace. When he shuts his lips, he is considered perceptive. You know, Abraham Lincoln said something similar to that, or at least it's attributed to him. We need to make sure that we practice brevity, that we only use the words that we have in a situation where it's necessary. Practice brevity. I promise you, you will never go back and say, you know, I just wish that I had talked more in life. But there may be situations where we look and we say, you know, I wish I could have taken some of those words that I said back. So practice brevity. Number 2, be accountable. Maybe you find yourself in the situation where you are trying to stop swearing, but you just can't do it. Be accountable. Very famously on television shows, we see people that have these swear jars, where every time they say an ugly word, they have to go and they put money in a jar. Maybe that's a good system for you. But I think we need to just be accountable to each other. Have a person that you're accountable for, that when you start saying things that maybe you ought not to, have somebody that you know in your life can remind you, hey, trying to do better than that. Because all of us are going to have this struggle. Look, all of us are going to be angry. All of us are going to make mistakes and do things that frustrate us. And we're going to have these opportunities where we just say things that we ought not to. In that situation, we need to have somebody that can hold us accountable for that. Remember your example. Remember your mission. Remember why you're trying to speak in a godly manner. And to remind you and say, look, that's not the way that we speak. So I think we need to be accountable to each other. Excuse me. Thirdly, we need to change our conversation topics. Change our conversation topics. We spend a lot of time talking about things that don't matter. I wish I could go and take all the hours of political rhetoric that I've heard so far in this election cycle and turn it into stuff that would actually make me smarter. If we could take away all the stuff, and I know politics is important, and I know that it's going to matter who the president is, but just all the nonsense that I've seen from both sides, wish I could just take it all away. We got to change our conversation topics. Think about this week that just passed. How much time you spent talking, and how much of that time, how many of those words that you used had to do with God or His Word. First is the political conversation, the conversations about college football starting next week, the conversations about food or hobbies or whatever it might be. How much of that kind of conversation we had versus how much we talked about eternal spiritual matters. And if we weigh those on a scale, I wonder which would hold the most weight. We need to change our topics of conversation. So practice brevity, be accountable, change our conversation topics. This is a very simple, practical one, but this is one that I saw that I think will really help us. Read the books of Proverbs and James. The writer of Proverbs, very wise man, obviously, mostly attributed to Solomon. You know, he actually wrote it where there are 31 chapters. And in the months that have 31 days, you can read one chapter a day, and you can read through the whole book in a month in a very short amount of time. If you've noticed, most of these passages that I've quoted this morning have come from the book of Proverbs because in his infinite wisdom, Solomon knew that people were going to struggle with their words. Similarly, in the New Testament, James has a lot of practical wisdom. James chapter 1, verse 19, James chapter 1, verse 26, and then essentially all of the third chapter of the book of James deal with taming the tongue. We won't take the time to read those passages this morning, but go through, read the book of Proverbs and read the book of James in a month. September 1st is right around the corner. It's this week. That's a very practical thing you can do to find some instruction on taming the tongue. Fifthly, this is the hard one. Learn to forgive people for things that they've said that have hurt you. You know, I guarantee you that in the last week I've said something that offended somebody. Maybe it's somebody here. Maybe it's in my own home. Maybe it's somebody that I'm friends with or a family member. Or maybe even in passing I forgot or neglected to say something that hurt somebody's feelings. I know that I'm guilty of it from time to time. When you use as many words as a preacher uses in a week, I know that some of them just aren't the right ones to use. You're probably in the same position where you've said something that hurt somebody. Wouldn't you want them to forgive you? We need to learn to forgive people when they say things that hurt us. They say things that are offensive, when they say things that come out wrong. When, you know, we are not as articulate as we would like to be. We're not a room full of eloquent speakers. We say things that are misunderstood and misinterpreted. We need to learn to forgive people when they hurt our feelings. We need to learn to forgive people when they say the wrong thing. So forgive. Then the last thing, and it really goes back to the first verse that we read. We need to practice saying things that build people up. Practice saying things that build people up. You know, tearing things down is really easy. If you go and you see a construction project, you may notice that the demolition crew looks a lot different than the construction crew. Meaning that when you go and you see the demolition of a building, it doesn't really take a lot of skill. It takes a lot of brute force. You'll see a lot of guys with hard hats and sledgehammers, and they go and they do some banging and they run through walls and they knock stuff down. And then, you know, somebody comes in with a big machine and scoops it all up into a dumpster, and then the site's kind of cleared. Doesn't take a lot of work to wreck stuff. Doesn't take a lot of knowledge or a lot of skill. But after that site has been cleared, there's another crew that comes in that's got some skill. Maybe a carpenter that does some framing, puts a frame together for a new building to be built. And you've got some skilled labor, right? You've got some plumbers that come in and some electricians, some engineers. You got some people that come in and really have some knowledge and some training so that they can build something that's there to last. That's how we have to be with our words and with our speech. Anybody can say a hurtful, hateful thing. But it takes a lot of knowledge and a lot of skill and a lot of love to say things that make somebody stronger. I found this poem this week that really illustrated that point. I want to share it with you and then we'll close. It says, I watched them tearing a building down, a gang of men in a busy town. With a ho-heave-ho and a lusty yell, they swung a beam and the sidewall fell. I asked the foreman, are these men skilled, the kinds you would hire if you were to build? He laughed and said, why no indeed, just common laborers is all I need. They can easily wreck in a day or two that which has taken builders years to do. So I said to myself as I went on my way, what part in the game of life do I play? Am I shaping my deeds to a well-made plan, carefully measuring with a rule and a square, patiently doing the very best that I can? Or am I a wrecker who walks the town content with the labor of tearing everything down? Sometimes we find ourselves in the position of tearing down. Sometimes we find ourselves hurting people or being reckless with our words. Sometimes we mess up. Sometimes we make mistakes. But God, through the blood of His Son, has been willing to forgive us. We ought to be willing to forgive as well. We ought to be striving, though, every day to be better. Growing in to godliness. And the picture of godliness that walked the face of this earth is Jesus. So we said godliness is something that is within, having that pure heart, and it manifests itself on the outside. And one of the ways is through godly speech. Listen, if we were to say this morning that during the invitation song, if you've said anything this week that you wish you could take back, you need to come down, none of us would be able to sit still. Every one of us would have to respond to the invitation, because I know that every one of us this week has said something that we regret and wish we could take back. Do better. There's too much at stake for us to continue to be making these mistakes. We're not sitting up here preaching this lesson because we want to say, oh, well, here's a list of topics that we should preach on every now and then. Speech, there's one. We're preaching on godly speech because it matters and it makes a difference. The way that we talk, the things that we say, the method in which we communicate matters, because we're communicating the greatest story ever told, the message of salvation through Jesus. And this morning, if you've strayed away from the right way of communication and you want to make it publicly right, we're going to have an opportunity for you to come down and make that right, to communicate to everybody here that you want to be stronger and be better. Maybe there's something privately in your life that you need to confess to God. During this invitation song, bow your head and give it to Him. Maybe there's something you want to share, but you don't have the courage to come down. Write it on a card and give it to one of the elders so we can pray for you. And this morning, if you're not a Christian, look, the message that I want to communicate to you is one that's very clear. That God loves you, that He created you, and your sin separated you from Him. But He's given you the means of reconciliation through the blood of His Son. All you have to do is accept that. You can do it this morning. Confess that Jesus is God's Son. Be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins. You can leave here this morning a new creature. The song we're going to sing says there's a fountain free. There's a gift of salvation flowing freely. And all you have to do is accept it this morning as we stand and as we sing.